What's up, y'all? This is Nick with From the Ground Up DIY, and today I'm going to show you all how to build a modern desk. So for the past few months I had the idea of making me a new desk, but I never really got around to it because I was working on other projects for people. But now it's time for me to make this happen. And right here, this is my current desk, and as you can see, this desk is real small and it's hard for me to be productive at. So for my new desk, I plan on making it way longer and also a little bit wider so that I can be as productive as I need to be. To start off, I decided that I was going to make the tabletop of the desk first, and to do this I'm going to use some 2" by 6" lumber. And for my lumber, I went ahead and pulled it out of the shed and set it on my picnic table, and then I sat down for a little bit to decide how wide I want my tabletop to be. And at first I was only going to use 4 boards, and this means that my tabletop would have been 24 inches wide, but after a little bit more thinking I decided that I wanted my tabletop a little bit wider, so I went ahead and used 5 boards, and this means that my tabletop would be 30 inches wide. Now that I know the width of my desk, it's time for me to go ahead and figure out the length. And for the length of my desk, I decided to go with 5 feet because this will be plenty enough room for me to be able to work how I need to work. And once I picked up my camera off the ground, I went ahead and marked my boards, and then I went ahead and pulled my table saw out so that I can get ready to cut my boards to the correct length. The boards that I have to cut down the sides are 8 feet long, and since I have a job site table saw, I went ahead and took the fence off my table saw and went ahead and put my crosscut sled on so that I can go ahead and make my cuts so that I can cut my boards down the size. Before making any cuts on my boards, I made sure that I clamped my boards down to my crosscut sled to make sure that they didn't tip over while I was cutting them, and then after that I went ahead and cut all my boards down to 5 feet. Now that all my boards are cut to size, to join my boards together for the tabletop, I'm going to be using dowels, and to drill the holes for the dowels, I'm going to be using my dowlet jig. Before I start drilling my holes for my dowels, I need to go ahead and mark on my boards where I plan on placing my dowels. And for each of my boards, I started on the end of each board, and I made a mark going 4 inches in. And after I made these marks, I made a mark from there going every 8 inches until I got near the end of my board. Now that I have my initial marks in place, I went back using my combination square just to darken over the marks so that when it's time to drill the holes for the dowels, I'll be able to see my marks clearly. To transfer the marks to my other boards, I went ahead and clamped all my boards together, and it's important that you do this because when you're making these marks, you want to make sure that they're all perfectly lined up, because if they're not, you're going to have a hard time joining the boards together once you have the dowels in. And once I had my boards clamped together, I went ahead and used my combination square just to make a mark going all the way across my boards and made sure that everything was aligned. And this is what the boards look like with all the markings for the dowels. To drill the holes for the dowels, the tools that you're going to need are a drill, a 1/2 inch drill bit, and a stop collar. And the reason why I'm using a 1/2 inch drill bit is because the dowels that I'm going to be using are 1/2 inch. So whatever dowels you plan on using, you want to make sure that your drill bit matches your dowel size. I went ahead and clamped my board down to my table just to make sure that my board won't move on me once I start drilling. On my dowel jig, as you can see here, there's different size holes depending on what dowel size you're going to be using. And since I'm using a 1/2 inch dowel, I'm going to be using the 1/2 inch hole. So I went ahead and placed my dowel jig on my board, and I tightened it up a little bit so that it could be snugged against the board, but I'm still able to slide it around. And I went ahead and lined up my 1/2 inch hole to the center of my mark. And once I had my jig in place where I wanted it to be, I went ahead and tightened it all the way so that it could be tight against the board. Now that the jig is in place, I went ahead and drilled the hole for my dowel. And one little tip that I can give y'all is that once you drill down and once you pull your drill out the jig, you want to make sure that you keep your drill in the same direction when you pull your drill out the jig. And I kind of learned this along the way because before I'll go ahead and drill it down, and then when I pull my drill out the jig, I'll change the direction. And when you do this, it'll end up leaving like little pieces of wood from where you drill from. It'll leave them down in the hole. But if you keep your drill in the same direction, when you pull it out, it'll pull out those little pieces of wood, and this will save you time later on so you won't have to clean the holes out. After this, I went ahead and started drilling the rest of the holes for my dowels into my boards. While drilling the holes, I realized that 3 of my boards are going to need holes on both sides, and when I was making my marks, I only made them on one side on all my boards. So to fix this, I went ahead and just used one of my boards that already had marks on it, and then I went ahead and transferred those marks on my other 3 boards that need marks on the other side of the board. With that being done, I went ahead and finished drilling all the holes that I need for my dowels. It's now time for me to go ahead and cut my dowel rod into smaller pieces so that I can use those pieces to join my boards together for the tabletop. And for those of you who don't know what a dowel is, it can be made of either wood, metal, or plastic. And basically it's just a rod that's used for structural support. And in this case, once I cut my dowel rod into smaller pieces, we're going to use those pieces to put in the holes. And once we do that, we'll be able to join the boards together so that we can make one whole tabletop. To determine the length that I need to cut my dowels, I went ahead and used my digital caliper so that I can measure the depth of the holes that I drilled. So the depth of the holes that I drilled ended up being close to 0.9 inches, so I just multiplied this number by 2 so I can get 1.8 inches, but I ended up using 1 3/4 of an inch, and I used this number because it's a little bit smaller, and I just wanted to make sure that my dowels weren't too long so that there won't be a gap in between my boards. I went ahead and used my jigsaw to cut my dowel down into 8 pieces, and each piece is 1 3/4 of an inch. As you can see here, I already glued 2 of my boards together, and I did this off camera just to make sure that I knew what I was doing since this is my first time using dowels. And for me to go ahead and glue my next board onto these 2 boards, I went ahead and clamped the boards down that I already glued together so that when I do install my dowels, the boards won't move on me. After that, I went ahead and grabbed one of the dowels that I cut, and I went ahead and put wood glue on it, and I also put wood glue inside the hole so that once I put the dowel inside the hole, it'll have a good bond. And to put the dowel in the hole, I just used my hammer and just hammered it down until it couldn't go down anymore. And for this, I recommend using a rubber hammer instead of a regular hammer so that you don't mess the end of your dowel up. I repeated this same process until I had all my dowels in place. Before attaching my board, I went ahead and put glue on my dowels and in between the dowels, and I went ahead and rubbed this glue in with my finger, and I also put glue in the holes of the board that I'll be attaching to my other boards as well. To attach my board, I went ahead and lined up the holes that I drilled with my dowels, and once I had everything in line and on center, I went ahead and grabbed my towel and went ahead and used my hammer to hammer my board down onto my dowels. And for this, if you don't want to use the towel, you can use a rubber hammer. And I decided to use the towel because I know when I first tried this and I was hammering my board down, I ended up getting marks on my wood. But if you have a rubber hammer, you shouldn't have to worry about this. And as you can see here, I'm kind of struggling trying to get this board on and getting it lined up with the dowels. So after struggling for a little while, I decided to stop so I could take a deeper look and see why the boards weren't lining up with the dowels. After taking a little minute to see what was going on, I figured out that one of my dowels wasn't lining up with one of the holes that I drilled, and this was my fault because when you drill these holes, you really gotta make sure that they're lined up perfectly or the dowels are not going to fit in the hole. In order to fix this, I decided that I was going to take the dowel out that wasn't lining up with the hole that I drilled, so I went ahead and disconnected my board from the rest of the tabletop. And once I did that, I went ahead and grabbed me a pair of pliers so that I can pull the dowel out of the board. While trying to pull the dowel out the board, I actually ended up breaking the dowel instead of pulling the whole thing out. And as you can see here, there's still a little piece of the dowel that's still sticking up. So to fix this, I went ahead and used my chisel so I could chisel it down. And then after that, I went ahead and grabbed my Orbital Sander so I could sand everything flat. Now that I got that piece of dowel on my board, I went ahead and put some fresh wood glue on my boards, because after doing all that stuff, the wood glue that I put on before had dried up. And after doing this, I went ahead and gave it a second try, and I was finally able to get my board attached to the tabletop. I went ahead and clamped up my tabletop so that the board that I just attached, it'll have a tight bond with the rest of the boards. After leaving the boards clamped up overnight, the next day I went ahead and came on out and just repeated the same process to attach 2 more boards. And once I got those boards attached together, my tabletop was finally complete. Next, it's time to go ahead and make the shelves for the desk, and I'm gonna get started on this once I get my camera set up straight. To make these shelves, I'm gonna be using 3/4 inch plywood, so I went ahead and grabbed my 4 foot by 8 foot sheet of plywood and just set it up on my table so that I can start measuring and cutting out the pieces that I need. So the shelves that I'm going to be making for the desk, they basically are just going to be 2 boxes, and the boxes are going to be in between the legs on each side of the desk, one on the left side and one on the right side. So to start off with this, I decided I was going to cut out my side pieces first, so I went ahead and started measuring. And after I measured for a little bit, I decided that I wanted to make my side pieces 18 inches by 24 inches. So I went ahead and drew my lines out so that I can begin to cut. To make the cuts for the shelves, I'm going to be using my circular saw. So before I start cutting, I went ahead and went to my wood stash so I could find a piece of wood that I can use as a straight edge for when I'm making my cuts. To start off, I lined up my circular saw with the line that I drew, and once I had that in the right position, I went ahead and grabbed my straight edge, and I also used a square to make sure that I lined up the straight edge correctly so that when I'm making my cut, it'll be a perfect straight line. And after doing this, I went ahead and clamped my straight edge down, and then I went ahead and used my circular saw so that I can make my first cut. I repeated this process to make the rest of the cuts, and I also decided to use my table saw as well to make some of the cuts for both of my side pieces and also my top and bottom pieces, which I decided to make 16.5 inches by 24 inches. Now that I got all the pieces cut out for the shelf, it's time for me to go ahead and assemble the shelf, and to do this, I'm going to be using pocket holes. I drill pocket holes on both sides of my bottom piece for the shelf so that I can go ahead and connect it to my side pieces. After this, I use my parallel bars to go ahead and clamp my side pieces to my bottom piece, and then I use a little wood glue to fill in the holes, and then I went ahead and drilled my pocket hole screws into the holes. Now that my bottom and side pieces are secured, I repeated the same process so that I could attach my top piece to my side pieces on my shelf. The shelf is now almost done. The only thing I need to do now is to add a back piece, but one thing I did notice about the shelf is that it's a little shaky, and for these shelves I need them to be as sturdy as possible because they're going to be supporting the tabletop of the desk, and they're also going to be a part of the legs. So after doing a little bit of thinking, I decided that I was going to add some corner supports to each of the 4 corners of the shelf, and this should make it sturdy how I need it to be. After measuring all the corners of the shelf, I decided that I was going to make the supports 3 inches wide and 18 inches long. For the supports, I'm going to be using the same 3/4 inch plywood that I used to make the shelves, so I went ahead and cut out the piece of plywood that I need to make the supports. I went over to my table saw so that I can cut my plywood into 4 pieces, and again, these pieces are 3 inches wide and 18 inches long. I made marks on each of my supports going about 1/4 of an inch in on each side, and I did this to prepare for the cuts that I need to make. And for the cuts, I need to cut a 45-degree angle cut on each side of my support so that it's able to fit in the corner of the shelf. And while I was doing this, I actually made a mistake, and the mistake that I made is that I didn't make my plywood cuts wide enough, because when I was cutting, I didn't realize how much wood my blade was taking off, and it was actually taking off an inch off of each side. So to fix this problem, I had to cut out some more plywood, and instead of doing 3 inches, I decided to do 5 inches so that when I actually do the cuts, it will end up being 3 inches wide. After cutting my new supports out, I went ahead and tried cutting the angles again on each side of my supports, and this time I was able to do it right, and this is what my supports look like with the 45-degree angles cut on each side. I put some wood glue along the edges of my support and then pressed my support against the corner of my shelf, and once I had the support in place where I wanted it to be, I used some wood screws and drilled some from the outside going into the support, going along both edges. And I did this just to make sure that the support is secure as possible. And for these screws, I made sure that I went far enough in with them so that later I could put some wood filler on top of them so that the screw would not be exposed. Now that my first shelf is finally complete, I had to repeat the whole shelf making process again until I was able to make me a second duplicate shelf. With the shelves being complete, it's now time to go ahead and make the legs for the desk. And for the legs, they're going to be made out of 2x4s, and to cut my 2x4s down to size, I'm going to be using my table saw with my Crosscut Sled. To start off, I'm going to be working on the bottom portion of the legs first, so I went ahead and cut out 4 pieces of 2x4s, and I cut each piece to about 8 inches. These 2 pieces are going to be standing straight up, and there's going to be a longer 2x4 in between them, which will be the bottom leg. And so for these pieces, I went ahead and centered them in the middle of the shelf, and once I had them centered, I did a 1-inch offset from the edge of the plywood, from the front and then also from the back. I went to my table saw to cut the bottom of the leg that's going to be in between the 2x4s, but when I made the cut, I forgot to take off the width of the actual 2x4s on each end, so I had went ahead and measured for this, and then I went back to my table saw and made my cut again, and then this time it was able to fit in between the 2x4s correctly. I went ahead and clamped all these pieces together so that I can go ahead and drill some screws in them so that I can get everything attached. I first pre-drilled the holes for my screws, and then I went ahead and drilled my screws in, and I drilled in 2 screws in the front of the leg and then 2 screws on the back. The bottom leg is now finished, so I went ahead and lined it up in the middle of my shelf so that I can prepare to attach it to the shelf. Once I had the leg in place where I wanted it to be, I went ahead and pre-drilled my holes, drilled my screws in, and now the leg is finally attached to the shelf. I repeated the same process to make another leg for the second shelf, and once I was done with this, it was time to go ahead and make the top legs for the desk. For my top legs, I cut my 2x4 down into 4 pieces, and each piece is 3.5 inches. And for the top legs, they're going to be in between the tabletop of the desk and the shelf. Before attaching my top legs to the shelf, I went ahead and clamped my shelves together side by side because by themselves they were a little bit shaky and I didn't want them to move on me when I had to drill the top legs on top of the shelf. So I went ahead and clamped them together, and I stood on top of them just to make sure that it was nice and sturdy. After doing this, I did my measurements and I was able to line up my top legs with the middle of my shelf, and I also did the 1-inch setback that I did for the bottom legs as well. Now that I got my legs in place where I want them to be, I went ahead and grabbed my drill so that I can go ahead and pre-drill some holes, and then I went ahead and drilled my screws in to attach the top legs to the shelf. For these top legs, the one thing that you want to make sure of is that all your legs are exactly the same height. So for the second pair of top legs that I need to make, I went ahead and cut those out, but before attaching them, I went ahead and matched them up with the ones I already drilled on just to make sure that they were exactly the same height, because if not, then your tabletop will be uneven once you put it on there. So make sure that all your legs are exactly the same height. After making sure that all the top legs are the same height, I went ahead and attached the last 2 top legs to the shelves. Now that the legs are finally attached to the shelves, I went ahead and grabbed my tabletop and set it on top of the legs just to get a feel for how the desk is going to look. I went ahead and grabbed the tabletop so that I could flip it over and lay it on the ground, and once I did that, I went ahead and did a few measurements so I could figure out where I plan on placing the legs, and my idea is to have the legs centered in the middle of the tabletop. I now got the legs in place where I want them to be, so I went ahead and traced around each of the legs, and I did this so that when I flip the desk back over and have it upright, I can go ahead and line the tabletop up with the legs. I had almost forgot, but I also drew these traced out spaces on the other side of the tabletop as well, because once I have the tabletop lined up with the legs, I'm going to be using some screws to drill them in to attach the tabletop to the legs. And you need these traced out spaces so you know exactly where to drill your screws in, so make sure that you draw out the traced out spaces on both sides of your tabletop. I picked the tabletop up and placed it on the legs, and once I had it on the legs, I went ahead and adjusted the legs to match up with the traced out spaces that I drew underneath the tabletop. Once I had everything lined up, I went ahead and pulled out my drill to go ahead and pre-drill some holes, and once I did that, I went ahead and drilled in all the screws that I needed to so that I could attach the tabletop to the legs. The desk is now assembled, but one thing I did notice about the desk is that it's a little shaky when I move it from side to side. So to fix this, I'm going to add a middle support in between the shelves, and by doing this will be able to make the desk sturdy like it needs to be. To make this middle support, I'm going to use some of the 2" by 6" wood that I had left over from making the tabletop. I measured the space in between the shelves for the middle support, and it came out to be 1 foot and 8.5 inches. And once I had this measurement, I went ahead and cut 2 pieces of my 2" by 6" down to this size on my table saw. Now I need to connect these boards together, and to do so, I'm going to repeat the same process as I did to connect the boards for the tabletop. So I went ahead and drew my marks out for where I plan on putting my dowels, and then I used my dowel jig so I can go ahead and drill my holes. And then I cut my dowels down to the correct length, and once I did that, I went ahead and inserted the dowels into the holes so that I could connect both of these boards together. I clamped the boards together so that they can dry overnight, and then I came back out the next day so I can go ahead and attach the middle support to the desk. To attach the middle support, I went ahead and measured so I can line it up in the center of the shelves, and once I had it in place where I wanted it to be, I went ahead and grabbed my clamp so that I can hold the middle support while I drilled in the screws to attach it. As you can see here, by just adding that middle support, it made the desk a lot more sturdier, and it's really not shaking anymore like it was before. It's now time to add the final touches to the desk before I get to staining, and one thing that I saw on the desk that I need to fix is that there are a few exposed screws showing on the shelves, so I'm going to go ahead and try to fix this real quick. The best way to probably fix this is to go ahead and unscrew the screws a little bit so that they won't be able to show, but since I had my angle support over where the screws was, I decided it would have been a lot of work taking that support off and then unscrewing the screws, so I just decided to use my angle grinder and just grind the screws down, and then later on I can just cover up the little spots with some wood filler. Next, I went ahead and started sanding down the desk. I first started by using 80 grit sandpaper, and then I worked my way up to 120 grit sandpaper and just sanded around the whole desk. One thing that I forgot to do before attaching my tabletop was to sand off the marks on top of the shelves and on the top legs, and so to get to these marks so that I could sand them off, I went ahead and attached my tabletop. Now that the tabletop is off, I went ahead and sanded off all the marks that were showing. I also noticed that underneath my tabletop, I still had the rectangles that I drew that I used to line up the tabletop with the legs of the desk. So once I saw these, I decided to go ahead and sand these off as well. Now that I got all the marks sanded off the desk, I noticed that there were still a few more screws that were exposed on the shelves. So I went ahead and grabbed my angle grinder so I can go ahead and grind the rest of the screws down that were showing. After taking care of those exposed screws and sanding down the rest of the desk, I went ahead and reattached the tabletop back to the desk. I decided to move the desk back into the shed, and while doing this I actually ended up chipping one of the corners of the desk. So to fix this, I went ahead and grabbed some wood glue and put some wood glue on the little piece that I chipped. And once I had put the glue on there, I went ahead and grabbed a clamp so I could clamp this piece back to the rest of the leg. And then I just let it sit there so it could dry. While this is drying, I'm going to go ahead and cut out the back panels for the shelves. And for these back panels, I'm going to be using 1/8 inch plywood. So I went ahead and measured out the size I need to make my plywood. And once I had this size, I went ahead and took it to my table saw so that I could cut my plywood down to size. As you can see here on my piece of plywood, I had two sides that are not straight. So I went ahead and ran it back through the table saw so I can get these sides straightened out. I use my finish nailer to attach my back panels to my shelves, and for this it will be better to use a brad nailer, but since I don't have one, the finish nailer will have to do. And the first time I tried to attach the plywood to the shelves, I ended up having the plywood a little bit off center, so I had to take the plywood off and I had to use a pair of pliers to get the nails out that I nailed in. But after doing this, I went ahead and got the plywood back on center, and I was able to use my finish nailer to nail it in. And I repeated the same process for the other shelf as well. Once again, I found some more marks underneath the desk, so I went ahead and grabbed my sander so I could sand these marks off. And after that, I went ahead and grabbed my wood filler so I could fill in any screw holes that I saw, and also to cover up the exposed screw spots that I had to grind down. It's finally time to prepare the desk for staining, and for my desk, I plan on it having like a zipper theme. So basically, I plan on drawing a triangle, and on the sides of the triangle, I'm going to have like a zigzag pattern. So from the top of the desk to the edge of the desk, it's going to look like it's like a zipper opening up. And to start off by doing this, I had to find the center of my desk, and once I found the center of my desk, I went ahead and started drawing out my triangle. Before drawing out my triangle, I need to find the angle in which I want to draw out my triangle, and to do this, I decided to use my digital angle finder. And after using this and playing around with it for a little bit, I decided that I was going to use an angle of 80 degrees to draw out my triangle. So I went ahead and drew out the triangle, making sure that I kept that 80-degree angle on each side of my triangle. And after I had it drawn out, I went ahead and laid my painter's tape down so that I could separate the triangle from the rest of the tabletop. To achieve the zigzag effect that I desire, I'm going to be using some pinking shears. And as you can see, these scissors, they got a little zigzag pattern to them. And I'm going to use these to cut along the sides of my tape on both sides so that when I stain my table, I can hopefully have the effect that I'm looking for. The wood stain that I'm going to be using on this desk is Minwax Espresso, and then I'm also going to use Varathane red oak. So to start off my staining, I went ahead and put some Minwax Pre Stain all over my tabletop, and I let this sit for about 10 to 15 minutes. And after that, I went ahead and grabbed a towel so I could wipe off the excess. And then after that, I went ahead and grabbed my Minwax Espresso. And for this, I did one side of the tabletop at a time. So I went ahead and put some stain on there and let it sit again for about 10 to 15 minutes, and then wiped off any excess. And now I repeated the same thing for the other side of the tabletop. I ended up getting a few stain spots on the middle of my triangle, and for this I'm going to be using the Varathane red oak, so I went ahead and got my sander so I could sand out the brown spots. While I was sanding the spots off the triangle, I accidentally ended up sanding a little bit of my painter's tape off, and by doing this, the size of my tape wasn't really straight anymore. So to fix this, I had to put some more painter's tape down so that the size of my triangle could be straight. And after I did this, I went ahead and grabbed my pre-stain again so I could stain the inside of the triangle. And then after that, I went ahead and applied my red oak stain. After wiping the excess stain off the triangle, I noticed that the triangle was a little bit too light for me, and I wanted it a little bit darker, so I went ahead and put another coat of stain on the triangle. Now that I'm done staining the top of my desk, I went ahead and started working on the legs, and for the legs I decided to use the red oak stain that I used for the triangle. For the shelves, I decided to use the Minwax Espresso stain, and I also used this stain for the middle support in between the shelves and also for underneath the desk. Once I got done staining the entire desk, I went ahead and let it sit overnight so it could dry, and then the next day I came out to see how my zigzag effect looked, and I went ahead and took the painter's tape off my desk. But as you can see here, the zigzag effect, it really didn't come out how I wanted it to. And I think the first thing that was wrong with it is that, as you can see here, the zigzags, they're too small, so you can't even really tell the effect that's trying to give. It really just looked like a straight line, to be honest. And also there's a few spots that kind of bled over. To make the design look better, I went ahead and put some painter's tape around the edges of my triangles, and then I went ahead and grabbed my sander so I could sand out the spots that bled through the painter's tape. After getting those spots out, I decided to use this Varathane golden oak stain for the inside of my triangle, and I went ahead and applied it on my desk. But after I got done, I decided that I really didn't like how it was looking, so I went ahead and got some sandpaper and had sanded it off. The next stain that I decided to try out was this Minwax ebony stain, and I don't know why I thought I was going to like this one more than the golden oak, but I went ahead and applied it anyways. And after I got it on the desk, I decided that I disliked it even more than the golden oak, so I went ahead and grabbed my sander and sanded this stain off as well. After those two failed attempts of trying to stain my triangle, I finally decided to use this Minwax natural stain. And for this natural stain, I really like it because it just brings out the natural color of the pine, and I feel like this goes well with the other colors that's on the desk. So I went ahead and applied this on my desk, and I stuck with it. After letting the natural stain dry, I went ahead and pulled the painter's tape off the desk, and one thing that I noticed about the size of my triangles was that they were not straight. And to fix this, I wasn't able to get this part on camera, but all I did was just put some painter's tape down and then use my red oak stain and my espresso stain to go back over the size of my triangles. And I did this until I was able to get the size of my triangles straight enough to my liking. Now that I'm done staining my desk, it's time to go ahead and put a coat of polyurethane on the desk. And for the polyurethane, it will help protect the desk, and it'll also give the desk a nice shine. So I started by putting the coat first on my tabletop. So before I put any polyurethane on the back of my desk, I noticed that there was a few rough spots on the back of the desk. So to fix this, I went ahead and used these 120 grit sanding blocks so I can get those little rough spots out and make them smooth first. And once I did this, I went ahead and put a coat of polyurethane on the back and on the bottom of my desk. While I had the desk in this position, I decided to go ahead and put my 1-inch felt pads on the bottom of my desk, and I put these on here so that the wood won't scratch up the floor once I place the desk in my room. Once I got my desk standing back upright, I went ahead and used my sanding sponge so that I could sand my tabletop lightly, and then I went ahead and put one more coat of polyurethane on my tabletop. I also repeated the same process for this shelf and added one more coat of polyurethane to it as well. One place that I forgot to put polyurethane on was on the top of the shelves, and for this it was really hard for me to reach it with my paintbrush, so instead I decided to use some wipe on poly and just use a rag so that I can be able to cover the top of the shelves. After doing this, I went ahead and took the desk outside so I can give it a final look over just to make sure that I didn't miss any spots, and from what I've seen, everything looked good, so that means the desk is now complete. So the last thing that I need to do is just to bring the desk into my room, and once I had the desk in my room, I went ahead and had to rearrange a few things, and I also needed to get a new lamp and a little decor going on. So once I had all these things, the desk was in place and it was ready for me to put it to good use. If you made it this far in the video, thank you for watching, and with this desk, I'm in love with it so far. I really like how I got way more space to work with, and now I can really be productive how I need to be. But make sure you guys like this video and also comment down below of what you think about the desk. Is there anything that I could have did better or anything that I could have added to the desk to make it better? Let's talk about it down below. And also, to support this channel, make sure that you subscribe and also share it with a friend or two. But until next time, peace, many blessings, and I'll catch y'all on the next one.